Okay, so I've just come across somewhat disturbing video from Eastern Ukraine, and it is on the Facebook group 1 Million United in Support of Ukraine Freedom, which is obviously a pro-Ukraine group. I won't beat around the bush. On this conflict, I'm absolutely on the side of Ukraine. So I'm not going to beat around the bush about that. That's where my allegiances or sympathies lie. But everything I'm going to say in this video is based on evidence and it's my candid thoughts on the situation. Um, so in this video, there is a group of about 5 men, um, and they're basically thrown out of some sort of military vehicle, whether it's a truck or I'm not sure the exact type of vehicle because there's not a big deal of focus on it. But anyway, they're thrown to the ground. The location isn't stated, but I'm guessing it's around Donetsk. It's been posted in the last few days. Anyway, these men are forced onto the ground, and they're wearing the insignia of the armed forces of Ukraine, the yellow and blue colours of the Ukrainian flag. Now, the guy that then comes to sort of interrogate them, um, probably late 20s. Um, he is wearing the insignia of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, which incidentally has only been recognized by South Ossetia, which is hardly a great thing to shout about. But, there's very little mandate there. Even Russia hasn't directly recognized it yet. But anyway, he goes on to verbally abuse these men. The men are clearly shaking. They are in a state of shock. They don't know what's going to happen. He goes on to verbally abuse them. He gets a sword out and rips off their insignia. He forces at least one of them to eat his own insignia. And basically, this guy is going around and humiliating these POWs and really behaving in a very degrading manner. They're then thrown into the back of another vehicle, and you can hear gunshots. And as this is going on, as the sort of ringleader of this group of this unit of the Donetsk People's Republic is shouting in the face. Um, some of them are being blindfolded, and you can hear gunshots in the background. But then you see the next set of the video, and they're all still alive. So that to me indicates that they're playing sick psychological games, stimulating execution. Um, so that's discussing behavior. The Donetsk People's Republic is directly armed by the Russian Federation. Um, so far, like I say, Russia hasn't directly recognized it as a republic, but Russia is clearly on the scene in this situation. I want to talk predominantly about Ukraine, but touch on some other issues as well. So there are people who still insist that Russia has no presence in Ukraine. That is nonsense. Russia itself has actually more or less admitted this. The so-called little green men, that is regular troops. This is how they're described on Wikipedia. Masked soldiers in unmarked green army uniforms and carrying modern Russian army military weapons and equipment that appeared during the Ukrainian crisis of 2014. The term was first used during the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, when those soldiers occupied and blockaded the Simferopol International Airport. In April 2015, retired Russian Admiral Igor Kasatonov said that the Little Green Men were members of the Russian Spetsnaz special forces units. According to his information, Russian troop deployment in Crimea included 6 helicopter landings, 3 landings of IL-76 with 500 people. And in December that year, Putin himself confirmed the presence of Russian people in Ukraine who were engaged in certain tasks, including in the military sphere, and added that this did not mean the presence of a regular Russian army in Ukraine. Well, of course, it's not a regular Russian army because Putin isn't stupid. He knows that that would, really give the game away. But this is blatantly the subjugation of a smaller neighbouring country. As for the referendum in Crimea, It is true that there was probably a large number of people who were pro-Russia and anti-Kiev. But the point about that referendum was deeply flawed because the there was no free vote. This was a case of those who were pro Moscow were allowed to cast their votes, and those who were pro Kiev on the surface were basically harassed and intimidated from casting their votes. The whole pretext of Russia's actions in Ukraine was that there was systematic discrimination of Russian speakers. Problem is, numerous investigations found that there was not systematic government level discrimination. There was corruption going on, but there was not systematic discrimination of Russian speakers, certainly not across the board. There may have been incidents of discrimination, but certainly not on the scale to warrant a full scale annexation of part of a sovereign country. And to be honest, it's basically the same excuse Hitler used in the 30s when he annexed the Sudetenland and other areas. The excuse was to protect German speakers. If we look at Russia's behaviour since 1989, there's a long track record of subjugating smaller territories. Um, from Chechnya in 1994, which is de facto part of the Russian Federation, but let's be clear, Russia's actions in Chechnya are absolutely brutal. And the things the Russian army has done, far, far worse than anything the American or British army has done on an individual basis, on a proportionate basis, far worse. Um, then there was Transnistria in 1992. There was the Georgian Republic in 2008. Russia knew that the world was watching the Beijing Olympics, so they took advantage of that situation. Um, Ukraine in 2014, and the Baltic states, incidentally, back in 1991. There is a long history of subjugating smaller nations. Now, Russia defenders or apologists basically say, oh, well, the West brought this on by enlargement of the EU and NATO presence in Eastern Europe. Whether you, or not you believe that is morally justified, this concept that, oh, well, the EU expanded, that justifies Russian invasion, is utterly absurd. It's utterly absurd. It's it's basically treating Putin like he's a child who disobeyed his parents, and oh well, that's what's going to happen. This is absurd. Russia is a powerful country that has been throwing its weight around for a very long time, and this week there's been reports from Amnesty International that, incidentally, before I go on to that, um, it doesn't stop with Russian irregulars operating in Ukraine. The Malaysia airline incident, now, did Russia directly order that shoot down? Of course not. Okay, you'd be pretty naive to believe that. Why would Russia do that against, what's Russia got against Malaysia? Most of the victims, I should say, were Dutch. That incident reminds me very much, although the circumstances are somewhat different, but it reminds me of Lockerbie insofar as the international wrangling is concerned. But numerous investigations have found that in all likelihood, the missile was manufactured in Russia. It certainly came from an area controlled by pro-Russian rebels. Now, the rights and wrongs of whether a passenger plane should have been flying over a war zone is another matter. Um, I've actually flown in that exact route, which is quite a strange thought. Literally a year before, 2013, I'd flown Malaysia Airlines Kuala Lumpur to Amsterdam, which was more or less exactly that same route. So for me, that's quite a strange thought. Um, but that's the situation, and of course, Russian state media have went out of their way to deny this. I'm not going to absolutely say Russia was responsible for that shootdown, but most of the evidence seems to point to certainly pro-Russian rebels as being responsible, armed by Moscow. If we look at the situation in Syria, and again, this is very, very important, because in this week, Amnesty International has reported that as many as 13,000 people have been hanged in a government run prison. 13,000 people. Now, the line of the Assad regime has always been we're just fighting terrorists. So they've justified their crimes against humanity by portraying every Syrian that they have killed as a terrorist, as being Al Nusra Front or Islamic State or any of the other sectarian Islamist factions that are operating in Syria. It's hard to keep track because there's now so many different factions on the ground. Um, what I've always found frustrating about the Syrian situation is that because of the brutality of ISIS, and the whole world knows how vicious ISIS is, people have actually believed the regime propaganda that it's just an embattled government fighting against terrorists. It was the Assad regime that started this war when they chose to brutally crush legitimate protests. The Islamists only took advantage of this situation later on, after the Russia China veto. That's when ISIS started becoming significant. So it really irritates me. More than irritates me, it outright pisses me off when people come out with these sweeping statements that the West created ISIS, the West is responsible for the war in Syria. So far, I've yet to see any actual hard evidence that as state policy, Washington, London, or Paris created ISIS. I have no doubt that Western arms at some point probably ended up in unsavory hands, because that's what happens in war. And certainly, I'm very critical of the West's role in the situation in Yemen. So, I'm not coming from a point of, oh, the West is good and Russia is bad here. That's not my perspective. I'm very unhappy about our support for Saudi Arabia. Very unhappy. But Russia has no right to pontificate. And I've made a lot of points about this, but it's still relevant. Whenever there's a video about Putin, you can guarantee that the sheeple who line up to praise Tsar Vlad, all these videos that say things like Putin puts BBC smartass in his place. Putin tells the truth about Syria. No, he doesn't. Putin has been towing the Assad government line the whole time. Putin's Russia has been shamefully arming this murderous regime that has directly led to tens of thousands of Syrian civilian deaths. Incidentally, the refugee crisis that there's been so much debate on in Europe and North America, Russia hasn't housed a single refugee. Neither, incidentally, have the wealthy Gulf states. So the amount of disinformation that is out there, the amount of pro-Russian propaganda, and people just blindly believe this like it's gospel. It's utterly pathetic. Um, I could say it's Russia Today's, it's towing the line, but I don't want to give RT that much credit. I think they're a sizable organisation, but they're not. Their scope is not that big. But I do notice something about RT viewers. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them tend to blindly believe everything RT tells them because it vindicates their own politics. And I want to just touch on one other situation, which I just find baffling. During the 2014 crisis, when the G20 summit was going on in Brisbane, Australia, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper famously confronted Putin directly. He said, I guess I'll shake your hand, but you need to get the hell out of Ukraine. Now, instead of being grateful that their leader stood up to this autocratic thug, people have a lot of Canadians online have denounced Harper and called him all sorts of names. Now, this could be petty politics playing out. It could be Canadian Liberals just being political. I don't understand that. I'm not a conservative. I don't know about Harper's domestic policies, but I give him credit for being one of the very few world leaders to actually speak out against Putin. And I'm sick and tired of Putin being portrayed as this hard man and, you know, he's made out to be this great heroic figure. He's not. He is far more a thug than a hero. And people who treat Putin like a liberator of Syria, that is a gross insult to the thousands of Syrian civilians directly killed by Russian weapons. Incidentally, Russia's making its military presence in Syria abundantly clear. Now, I'm going to leave with a few caveats. In war, There's cruelty on both sides, almost always. So regarding that video I mentioned, I'm not saying that the Ukrainian side is entirely innocent, and I'm sure there will be examples of Ukrainian forces mistreating rebels. Um, both sides are wrong. War is cruel, and these things happen in war. But it does say a lot about Russia's so-called benevolent influence in these situations. I'm so tired of Putin fanboys and fangirls coming online and coming out with nonsense about Putin's Russia being a liberating force. Putin's Russia is behaving like the old Tsarist Empire. And they've been doing that everywhere. Ukraine, um, Georgia, Syria. It's just a country that is absolutely throwing its weight around. Um, and like I said, this is not to say that Britain or America or France is innocent, but there has to be a counter in the narrative because what we've been seeing so much of online, if you go to any video about Putin, it is overwhelmingly positive and it's lavish praise, and it's all about Putin telling the truth about this or that. Are these people fucking stupid that they can be so lazy in their slavish belief of Russian state propaganda? Give me a break. Even if you don't like Western policy, that you would believe, I have much more respect for someone who says, oh, well, they're all liars, all governments are corrupt, than someone who says, oh, Russia is the noble savior of the world. I'm not saying people have to like Western governments, but the narrative that goes on here is just bullshit. That Russia is some sort of liberating force. Wherever Russia has a presence, you see human rights abuses, you see abuse of power, you see these proxy situations. Russia's behaving exactly the way the Soviet Union did in the Cold War. So one of the main criticisms of Obama is that he wasn't assertive enough on Putin. That's somewhat ironic because, ironically, this is something that the hard left and actually the neoconservative right have in common. They both seem to have this strange apathy towards Putin's Russia. Um, and I think Trump does have a lot of explaining to do in terms of, he says he doesn't know Putin. I understand the need for diplomacy. I understand the argument that two of the world's most powerful countries working together can be a good thing. That would be all very well if it wasn't for the way Russia was behaving right now. Trump says, let's work with Russia to take on terrorists. But in doing this, he's totally mitigating the brutality of the Assad regime. So I don't think Trump has any right to talk about the previous administration being soft when he is basically making himself out to be a yes man for Vladimir Putin. That's not diplomatic, that's naive. And you do have to ask questions when you look at Trump's business interests, when you look at Rex Tillerson's business interests in Russia. This isn't insignificant. So I would politely say to Trump supporters, um, you call Obama weak, but how do you justify Trump's constant excuses for Putin? Because I understand the need to be diplomatic, but there's being diplomatic and then there's just being naive, and Trump strikes me as the latter when it comes to Russia. Um, and what troubles me is Trump talks about terrorists, and that's fine. That's tough talk. It's needed, but he's mitigating the brutality of the Assad regime, and he's basically playing the game that Russian state media is. So these situations are complex. They're not black and white, but I am so fed up with people who. And the thing is, it isn't just Russians. If it was Russians, you could think, okay, well, that's nationalism at play. What I find astonishing is the sheer number of Westerners who go out of their way to make excuses for Russia and Putin. The number of Canadians, the number of Americans, the number of Brits who actually think that Putin is some sort of savior. This is perverse. Putin is the most powerful Russian leader probably since Stalin. And I'm even thinking beyond Brezhnev, beyond Khrushchev. So, this is the way Russia's behaving. I am not anti Russian. I like Russian culture. But as for the Russian government, its behavior over the past 10 years has been nothing but imperialistic, thuggish, and bullying. And it's masqueraded as a liberator in all of this. Now, you could say the same thing about American power, but the difference is, I mean, put it this way, American state media is not allowed to operate in Russia. Russian state media can operate in the US. So it's not a level playing field. I could go on and on about America's actions in Iraq and so on. It wouldn't be difficult. But the point is, those things are very well documented. The argument I'm making is that Russia's crimes are not documented anywhere near enough. They're certainly not spoken about enough. So all I'm doing is trying to balance out the narrative.